desert wind whispered like an ancient ghost across the dunes of Egypt. It carried with it the scent of dust, sweat, and blood, a promise of what was coming. The year was 1250, the age when kingdoms rose and fell by the swing of a sword, when honor and betrayal walked side by side. And the Nile was more than a river, it was the lifeblood of empires far in the distance. Beyond the golden horizon, the banners of two great forces rippled beneath the sun. One belonged to the Mamluks, fierce warriors forged in the fires of servitude, who now stood as the defenders of Egypt. The other belonged to the Crusaders of France, an army of steel and faith led by men who believed they carried the will of God. The sun had barely risen when the sound of marching boots broke the silence. Thousands of soldiers moved across the desert plain, armor glinting like shards of glass beneath the light. The Crusaders advanced with disciplined rows of knights in chainmail, their faces hidden behind iron masks, their banners painted with crimson crosses. Behind them, siege towers creaked on massive wooden wheels, pulled by teams of oxen that groaned under the weight. Across the field, the Mamluks waited. No shouting, no restlessness, just a calm readiness like predators before a hunt. Their leader, Emir Baybars, sat astride a black stallion, his eyes hidden beneath the shadow of his turban. His men watched him for a signal, every breath timed with the wind. The first hour of dawn passed in silence, broken only by the slow beat of war drums echoing from both sides. Dust swirled between the armies, blurring the line between man and mirage. And then, the horns sounded. The Crusaders roared, their charge like thunder shaking the earth. Horses screamed as iron met sand. Spears lowered, banners snapped, and the desert came alive with chaos. The front lines collided with such force that even the ground seemed to cry out. The Mamluks, nimble and precise, moved like a tide. Arrows hissed through the air, piercing through the Crusader shields. The mounted archers rode in arcs, circling the enemy like hawks. But the Crusaders were relentless, trained in the brutal wars of Europe. They held their ground, shields locked tight, blades flashing like lightning from atop a nearby ridge. A group of Bedouin tribesmen watched the carnage unfold. They were neither friend nor foe to either side, yet they knew the outcome of this battle would decide the future of the desert. The eldest among them muttered a prayer to the wind, his wrinkled hands clutching the sand that slipped away like time itself. By midday, the battlefield had become a furnace. The heat burned through armor, and the air shimmered with rising waves of dust. The screams of the wounded carried across the dunes like the wailing of lost souls. Blood soaked the sand until it turned a deep, dark red. A young Mamluk soldier, barely 20, stumbled through the smoke, his sword trembling in his hand. His name was Yusuf. He had joined the army to protect his homeland. Not to kill, but now he was knee-deep in corpseless men who had faces, families, and stories of their own. He looked toward the horizon and saw the Crusader banners pushing forward. Panic clawed at his chest, but then he heard a voice, deep, commanding calm. It was Baybars. "Hold your line," the emir shouted, his sword raised high. "The Nile will not see foreign blood flow within her banks." The men rallied. Yusuf found his strength again, gripping his weapon tighter. Around him, the Mamluks formed a new wall of steel. And when the Crusaders came crashing again, they met a storm of blades. In the heart of the chaos, Baybars rode straight into the enemy ranks. His sword cut through the air with deadly precision. He moved like a shadow, his strikes silent and clean, his eyes unblinking. The Crusaders, who faced him, fell one by one, clanging against the sand like broken bells. On the other side of the battlefield, Crusader commander named Sir Guillaume watched in disbelief. He had fought in Jerusalem, Antioch, and Acre, but never had he seen such discipline in Muslim warriors. His knights were strong, but the heat, the dust, the Mamluks' tactics were tearing his formation apart. He turned to his banner bearer. "Sound the retreat. Regroup at the ridge. But before the order could spread, a flaming arrow struck the banner. The flag ignited, falling to the ground, the cross burning in the sand. Guilam's heart sank as he realized there would be no retreat, not today. The Mamluks pressed harder, her war cries echoing across the dunes. Arrows rained down in sheets. Camels carrying archers advanced from the flanks, cutting off any escape. The Crusaders were surrounded by afternoon. The battlefield was a graveyard. The once proud Crusader banners lay trampled and torn. Horses wandered aimlessly, their riders dead or dying. The air stank of smoke and iron. Why, Us-Uf stumbled again, exhausted, his vision blurred from the heat. He fell to his knees beside a dying Crusader man whose face was barely older than his own. The Crusader's lips moved, whispering something in a language Yusuf didn't understand. He reached out, took the man's hand, and held it until it went cold. In that moment, he felt the weight of war, the futility of it, the way it turned boys into ghosts before their time. As the sun began to set, the last of the Crusader resistance crumbled. Baybars stood at the center of the field, surrounded by his surviving men. His armor was dented, his blade chipped, but his eyes were steady. He looked upon the carnage, not with pride, but with sorrow. He dismounted, knelt beside the body of a fallen soldier, and pressed his hand into the sand. "May this earth remember your blood," he whispered, not knowing if the man was friend or foe. The wind began to rise again, sweeping across the battlefield, erasing footprints, carrying away the echoes of death. The desert, timeless and patient, was already reclaiming what belonged to it. That night, the sky over Egypt was red. Fires burned where the wounded had fallen. The Nile flowed silently in the distance, reflecting the flames like molten gold. The surviving soldiers sat in silence, their faces hollow, their souls heavy with what they had seen. Yusuf sat apart from the others, staring into the darkness. He could still hear the clash of swords in his mind, the cries of men fading into the wind. He wondered if this was victory or simply survival, far beyond the horizon in a Crusader camp that had never received word of the slaughter. Another army was already preparing to march. They would come with vengeance in their hearts, driven by faith and fury. And so the war in Egypt was far from over. The sands had only tasted the beginning. The desert would remember. It always did. The dawn after the battle came slowly, wrapped in silence and the pale gray mist of the desert. The smoke from the burned siege towers still curled into the air like dying ghosts, and the wind carried the scent of death over the Nile plain. The ground, once golden and pure, was now blackened and torn a scar upon the face of Egypt. Crows circled overhead, dark shapes against a blood-red sky. They landed among the corpses, picking at the remains of the dead. Soldiers moved quietly between them, searching for survivors or gathering weapons. The groans of the dying echoed like a grim song between the dunes. Emir Baybars walked through the wreckage, Kay's boots crunching on shattered shields and splintered wood. His armor was still streaked with dried blood, but he moved with a measured calm. Around him, his lieutenants followed silent, watchful men who understood the weight of victory. They passed rows of Crusader bodies, lying tangled together. Their once white tunics, now soaked in dust and blood. One of Baybar's captains, a grizzled veteran named Faraj, broke the silence. "They came with the arrogance of kings," he said bitterly, nudging a fallen knight with his foot. "Now they rot in the sand." Baybars didn't reply. His eyes lingered on a single figure Crusader commander. His armor ornate, his hand still clutching the hilt of a broken sword. The emblem of France gleamed faintly on his breastplate. Baybars knelt beside him and studied his face. He looked young, perhaps not yet 30. "Bury him," Baybar said quietly, "and the rest. No man deserves to be left to the vultures, even our enemies." Faraj frowned. "They would not do the same for us." "I know," Baybars replied. That is why we are not like them. Behind him, Yusuf watched. He had not slept since the battle. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the faces of the dead son he had killed himself. His hands trembled as he held a water skin, the water inside trembling with each breath he took. When Baybars turned toward him, Yusuf quickly lowered his eyes. Your name? The emir asked. Yusuf, my lord. You fought bravely yesterday, Yusuf, Baybar said. I saw you hold the line when others fled. Yusuf hesitated. I only did what was asked of me, my lord. Baybars gave a faint smile. That is what makes a true soldier. He looked out toward the horizon where the sun was climbing higher, burning away the mist. But the war is not over. More crusaders will come. They always do. Faraj stepped forward. Scouts report movement near the delta. The Franks are regrouping. There may be thousands more. Bars nodded slowly. Then we must be ready before they cross the Nile. If they reach Cairo, it will not be the walls that fall, it will be Egypt itself. He turned back to Yusuf. Go with the burial teams. Learn what this victory cost us. Then come to me when the sun sets. You will march again soon. Yusuf bowed and left, his heart heavy. He joined a small group of soldiers digging graves beyond the battlefield. The sun burned hot overhead, and every shovel of sand felt heavier than the last. They worked in silence, each man lost in his own thoughts. Sometimes they found crusaders still alive, barely breathing, whispering prayers to a god Yusuf did not know. The soldiers offered them water, then mercy, as the day passed. The Nile shimmered in the distance, calm and beautiful, as if unaware of the horrors beside it. Children from a nearby village appeared, carrying baskets of bread and clay jugs of water. They moved among the soldiers, offering what little they had. One girl, no older than 12, handed Yusuf a piece of flatbread. Thank you, he said softly. She nodded, her eyes solemn. My father died yesterday, she whispered. He was a soldier. Hughes froze. He wanted to say something, anything, but no words came. The girl simply turned and walked away, her small figure disappearing into the glare of the desert. That night, the sun sank behind the dunes, the campfires flickered like stars fallen to earth. The soldiers sat in circles, their faces lit by the orange glow. Some sang old songs to drown the silence. Others drank until they forgot the faces that haunted them. Baybars stood apart, gazing into the flames. Faraj approached quietly, holding a scroll sealed with red wax. A messenger from Cairo, he said. It came this evening. Baybars broke the seal and read. His expression darkened. The Sultan is dead, he murmured. Faraj's eyes widened. Dead? How? Poison, Baybars replied. And now his brother claims the throne. Cairo will be in chaos. Faraj cursed under his breath. Then who leads Egypt now? Baybars looked toward the river. Awan. Not truly. He folded the scroll and stared into the distance. That means every enemy we face will smell weakness. The Crusaders, the Mongols, even our own. Faraj nodded grimly. Then we hold the Nile until Cairo chooses a king. Baybars turned to him. No, we march to Cairo. If we do not claim leadership now, others will, and Egypt will burn from within. Faraj hesitated. You would take the throne. Baybars didn't answer. He simply said, I will take what Egypt needs. Meanwhile, Yusuf sat by the riverbank, washing the dirt from his hands. The water felt cool, alive. He looked up at the stars and wondered how many men were looking at the same sky crusaders, Mamluks, peasants, kings, all of them chasing glory or survival, or something neither could name. He closed his eyes and whispered a quiet prayer not for victory, but for peace. But peace was a word the desert had long forgotten at that very moment. Miles away, beyond the Nile Delta, torches burned in the darkness. The surviving crusaders, led by Sir Guillaume's brother, Lord Etienne, had reached the ruins of their outpost. The men were wounded, hungry, and furious. Etienne stood among them, his eyes blazing beneath his helmet. "They killed my brother," he said, his voice trembling with rage. "They think the desert will protect them, but the cross will rise again over Egypt." He turned toward his captains. "Send word to Acre. Tell them we march again. This time we will not retreat." The men cheered weakly, their faith rekindled by fury. The torches reflected in their eyes like fire in glass. And so, in the darkness of the desert, two forces began to move again, one driven by duty, the other by vengeance. Between them lay the Nile, the line that would soon be drowned in blood once more. The wind rose suddenly, carrying with it the faint echo of drums. Somewhere in the distance, a storm was building. The desert could feel it. The war for Egypt was far from over. It had only changed its shape. The city of Cairo trembled under the weight of uncertainty. In the days following the Sultan's death, the air itself seemed tense thick with whispers of betrayal, ambition, and fear. From the narrow alleys of the old market to the marble halls of the citadel, everyone spoke in hushed tones, unsure who ruled Egypt now. Smoke still drifted from the farmlands near the Nile, where the last remnants of the Crusader invasion had been crushed. Merchants who once shouted prices now spoke only in murmurs. Even the muezzin's call to prayer sounded quieter, as if afraid to wake the wrath of fate. Emir Baybars entered the city at dawn, his army behind him, silent, disciplined, faces hardened by desert war. The people lined the streets to watch them pass. Some threw flowers, others stared with suspicion. Baybar's name had spread across Egypt like wildfire, the man who saved the Nile, the warrior who turned back the Franks. But power was a fragile thing in Cairo, and heroes often became threats overnight. Inside the citadel, the air was cool and heavy with the scent of incense. The throne room glimmered with gold mosaics and deep red banners. But the men gathered there were anything but calm. At the center sat the new sultan, a young and uncertain ruler named Al-Muazzam Turanshah. His father's throne seemed too large for him, his crown too heavy. Around him stood the court viziers, generals, scholars each, measuring Baybars with cautious eyes as he approached the dais. Baybars bowed slightly, but did not kneel. "My lord," he said evenly, "the Crusaders have been driven back to the sea. Egypt stands free again." The Sultan forced a smile. "So I have heard. Your name echoes through every campfire and tavern in the land. The people call you the Lion of the Nile." Baybar's expression did not change. "Titles or wind, my lord. What matters is that Egypt remains united. But the Franks regroup even now. If we do not prepare, they will return stronger." A Turanshah's smile faded. "You speak as though you command Egypt, Emir." Baybars met his gaze. "I speak as one who bleeds for it." A murmur rippled through the court. One vizier, an old man with trembling hands, whispered something to the Sultan. Turanshah nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing. "You forget your place, Baybars. You serve the throne, not stand beside it." The tension in the room thickened. Faraj, standing among the guards, tensed, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. Baybars inclined his head slightly. "Of course, my lord. I serve Egypt. As do you." Turanshah hesitated, unsure if the words were loyalty or warning. Outside the citadel, the streets buzzed with rumors. Some said Baybars planned to overthrow the Sultan. Others swore the Sultan would have him executed before sunset. Yusuf heard the whispers as he made his way through the crowded bazaar, his armor traded for plain robes. He had been assigned to the city garrison. But the peace felt wrong, like a calm sea before a storm. He stopped at a stall where an old blacksmith hammered a blade against an anvil. Sparks flew with each strike. "You've come from the front, haven't you?" the blacksmith asked without looking up. Why us? You have nodded. I was at the Nile. The man grunted. Then you've seen the truth. The war doesn't end when the fighting stops. It just changes faces. Yusuf frowned. What do you mean? The blacksmith lifted the blade, inspecting its edge. The real war is in here, he said, tapping his chest. Men like Baybars fight for honor. Men like the Sultan fight for power. The rest of us just survive between them. Before Yusuf could reply, a horn sounded from the citadel. The people turned, startled. Soldiers began to march through the streets, armor glinting under the sun. An arrest. Someone shouted, "The Sultan moves against Baybars." Yusuf froze. Without thinking, he ran toward the citadel. The gates were already closing, guards shouting orders. Inside, chaos reigned. The Sultan's soldiers had surrounded the Mamluk camp. Swords were drawn. Shouts echoed through the courtyards. Baybars stood in the middle of it all, unarmed, his expression unreadable. Tarancha appeared on the balcony above, flanked by his viziers. Baybars al-Bundakdari, he called out, his voice trembling with forced authority. You are accused of treason and conspiracy against the throne. You are hereby stripped of command and placed under arrest. A hush fell over the courtyard. The Mamluks looked at one another, waiting for Baybar's command. He simply stared up at the Sultan and said quietly, "You would condemn the man who saved your kingdom?" Tarancha's face twisted with anger. "I will not share my throne with a slave who forgets his chains." Something broke the invisible line that had held the world together until that moment. Faraj drew his sword. "For the Emir," he shouted. The courtyard erupted into chaos. Steel clashed against steel, shouts and screams echoing off the stone walls. The Sultan's guards tried to hold the line, but the Mamluks fought like lions cornered. Yusuf pushed through the crowd, his heart pounding. He had no plan, only instinct to protect Baybars. Baybars himself stood still for a moment, eyes closed as if listening to the sound of fate turning. Then he moved. In one swift motion, he disarmed a guard, spun, and struck. The blade flashed like lightning, and blood splattered across the marble floor. Tarancha shouted for his men to hold, but fear had already taken them. The viziers fled. The Sultan stumbled backward as Baybars advanced toward the steps. "Stop," Tarancha screamed. "You would kill your Sultan." Baybars stopped at the foot of the dais. "No," he said softly, "but Egypt will not die for your fear." The Sultan tried to speak, but before he could, one of Baybar's men, furious, desperate, launched forward and struck. The blade sank deep. Tarancha gasped, clutching his chest, then fell, his crown rolling across the marble with a hollow sound. Silence. The fighting stopped as suddenly as it began. Everyone stood frozen, staring at the body. Baybars looked down at the fallen Sultan, then turned to his men. "Bury him with honor," he said quietly. "Egypt needs no martyrs, only stability." That night, Cairo did not sleep. Fires burned in the streets, lighting the faces of people who didn't know whether to cheer or mourn. Why us? Uf sat alone on the citadel wall, staring at the city below. Baybars approached silently and stood beside him. For a long time, neither spoke. Finally, Yusuf said, "You never wanted the throne, did you?" Baybars shook his head. "No, but sometimes fate does not ask what we want. It demands what must be done." Yusuf looked out over Cairo, the city glowing like a sea of stars. "And what must be done now?" Baybar's eyes hardened. "The Crusaders will return, and the Mongols march west. If Egypt is to survive, she must be ruled by strength, not fear." He placed a hand on Yusuf's shoulder. "Remember this, soldier, every empire begins not with peace, but with sacrifice." Below them, the city murmured like a restless ocean, unaware that history had just shifted in the space of a heartbeat, far beyond the city walls. Across the Mediterranean, a messenger rode into the camp of Lord Etienne. He dismounted, breathless, and handed him a sealed letter taken from a dying spy. Etienne broke it open and read, "The Sultan of Egypt is dead," the note said. Baybars reigns in his stead. Etienne's lips curled into a cold smile. Then Egypt bleeds again, and this time I will finish what my brother began. He turned toward his captains. "Prepare the fleet. We sail at dawn." The desert wind howled that night, carrying the promise of another war, one born not of faith, but of vengeance and ambition. Egypt slept uneasily beneath the shadow of both victory and doom. The Nile flowed on, indifferent, ancient, and eternal. The sea crashed against the shores of Damietta like an army of ghosts. The gray morning light painted the waves silver, and the gulls screamed overhead as if warning the living to turn back. But the ships kept coming, hundreds of them, sails swollen with wind, banners snapping in defiance. The cross of Christ fluttered against the Egyptian breeze once more. Lord Etienne stood on the prow of his flagship, his armor darkened with salt and age, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Behind him, his men prayed, sang hymns, or sharpened their swords in silence. He had waited months for this moment, months of gathering allies, of promising glory and salvation to kings who had long forgotten the Holy Land. Now, as Egypt's coastline rose before him, he felt the ghost of his brother whisper in the wind. This time, he murmured, "The Nile will drown them all." The fleet struck the Egyptian shore like thunder. Siege towers, catapults, and war wagons rolled down the ramps as the Crusaders poured onto the beach. The first few hours were chaos, soldiers shouting, horses panicking, ships unloading supplies. But Etienne's command was ruthless. By midday, the Crusaders had established a stronghold, walls of wooden stakes, trenches dug deep, banners rising over the dunes. They named the camp fort St. Louis, after the fallen king who had once led them to Egypt and died trying. Etienne believed this was fate's way of finishing his brother's work. As the sun climbed higher, scouts returned from the desert with news. The Mamluks were marching north. Etienne's lips curled into a grim smile. "Let them come. We will crush them here before they ever reach Cairo." He ordered his engineers to raise great trebuchets along the dunes, facing the Nile. He wanted the Mamluks to see them from miles away, to feel the weight of their own doom before the first stone flew. Meanwhile, deep within Egypt, Baybars was already preparing. The news of the Crusader landing reached Cairo like a spark in dry straw. Messengers galloped through the streets, shouting warnings, their horses foaming at the mouth. The people panicked, remembering the last invasion, the smoke and the screams. In the citadel, Baybars stood over a large map spread across a marble table. Candles flickered around him, their light casting sharp shadows on his face. Faraj stood at his side, armored and ready. Yusuf waited near the doorway, silent but alert. "How many?" Baybars asked. "Nearly 20,000, Faraj replied, "and more coming from the sea." They had fortified Damietta and begun construction of siege engines. Baybars' jaw tightened. "Then we meet them before they reach the delta. The Nile will not be their road to Cairo." He turned to Yusuf. "You rode with me at Mansoura? You've seen how the Franks fight. Tell me what you remember." Yusuf straightened. "They march in tight formations. They rely on heavy cavalry and faith, but their armor slows them in the sand. If we strike fast, from many sides, they'll falter." Baybars nodded approvingly. "Good. We'll draw them out, break their lines, and strike from the river." Faraj frowned. "They'll expect that, of course," Baybars said. "That's why we won't do it their way." He pointed to the map. "We'll cut their supply lines from the coast, starve them, burn their provisions, poison their wells. When they are weak, we strike from the shadows." Faraj grinned. "You mean to turn the desert against them?" Baybars' eyes gleamed. "The desert is Egypt's oldest ally. That night, the Mamluk army moved like a whisper through the dunes. Thousands of riders, dressed in black and armed with curved swords, vanished into the horizon. Torches were covered, voices hushed. The only sound was the distant howl of the wind. Yusuf rode among them, the taste of dust thick in his mouth. He could see the faint glow of the Crusader fires on the horizon like a false dawn. He thought of the faces he'd seen last time, the dying men who had looked no different from him. And yet, here he was again, marching toward another blood-soaked sunrise stopped by dawn. The Mamluks had surrounded the Crusader camp. They watched from the ridges as Etienne's men prepared for battle-shining armor, banners high, prayers echoing across the dunes. Etienne himself rode along the front lines, shouting words of faith and fury. "Remember your brothers who died here," he roared. "Their bones lie beneath this sand. Let this ground be their vengeance." The Crusaders cheered, slamming their swords against their shields. Then, without warning, the first arrow flew. It struck a knight clean through the throat. He fell without a sound. A moment later, the sky was filled with arrows' black streaks cutting through the sun. The Crusader front line buckled under the rain of death. Etienne shouted for his men to hold, but the sand exploded with fire as Mamluk engineers launched pots of burning oil from the ridges. The beach became an inferno. Baybars watched from his horse, eyes steady, giving hand signals that rippled through the ranks like waves. His cavalry swept down from the dunes, moving in perfect formation, striking the Crusader flanks with precision. Etienne countered fiercely, leading a charge of knights into the center. Their lances lowered, their horses screaming, they crashed into the Mamluk lines. The ground shook. For a moment, it seemed the Crusaders might break through, but Baybars was waiting. He raised his sword, a flash of steel in the desert, light, and his hidden reserve forces surged forward from behind a ridge. The Crusaders found themselves surrounded on three sides. Yusuf fought near the river, his blade slick with blood. He could barely tell friend from foe amid the smoke and chaos. A Crusader lunged at him, shouting in French, and Yusuf barely parried the strike. Their blades locked, eyes meeting for a brief, human moment. Then instinct took over. Yusuf drove his sword through the man's chest. The knight gasped, blood spilling from his lips. He fell, whispering a prayer. Yusuf stepped back, chest heaving. For a heartbeat, the battle fell away. He looked around at the dying, the burning siege towers, the shattered crosses lying in the sand, and wondered if victory ever truly belonged to anyone by midday. The Crusader line was collapsing. Etienne's banner still flew, but it was drenched in smoke and ash. His men fought with desperation, their faith fading as their strength gave out. From the ridge, Baybars signaled again. The Mamluks advanced, encircling the last Crusader holdouts. Etienne, bloodied but unbroken, raised his sword high. "You may kill us," he shouted, "but the cross will rise again." Baybars rode forward slowly, his horse cutting through the smoke. He stopped a few paces from Etienne, the two men locking eyes warrior to warrior. "Your cross has fallen enough times," Baybars said quietly. "Go home while you still can." Etienne spat blood into the sand. "My home is wherever your empire burns." Hay swung his sword, but his strength failed him. Baybars parried once, then struck. Etienne fell, his body hitting the sand with a dull thud. Silence swept the battlefield. The surviving Crusaders threw down their weapons. The Mamluks raised their banners, and for the second time in a decade, the Nile was defended as the sun set. The waves carried the wreckage of Crusader ships out to see broken masts, splintered shields, the echoes of hymns fading into the wind. Yusuf stood by the water's edge, watching the tide wash away the blood. He could see Baybars in the distance, his silhouette outlined against a dying light. For a long time, neither moved. Both men knew the cost of what they had won when Yusuf finally turned away. He whispered to the river, "May this be the last." But deep in the horizon, beyond the sea and beyond the desert, other empires were stirring. The Mongols were already marching west, and Egypt's true trial was yet to come. The desert wind rose once more, carrying both triumph and warning across the endless sands. The war was over, but peace had not yet begun. The fires of Damietta had long gone cold, but Egypt still smelled of smoke. Weeks had passed since the Crusaders were driven into the sea, and yet the land remained uneasy. The Nile ran heavy and dark, swollen from the rains, carrying both life and the memory of death through its winding veins. The people rebuilt what they could, but the sound of hammers on stone was haunted by silence. In Cairo, the banners of victory hung across the citadel walls. The markets had reopened, the mosques were full again, and merchants sang praises to the Lion of Egypt, Baybars al-Bundakdari. Children played in the shadow of the fortress, their laughter mixing with the call to prayer. Outwardly, peace had returned, but in the marble halls of power, another storm was gathering. Baybars sat alone in the audience chamber late one night. The candles burned low, their wax running like tears. A map of the known world stretched before him, its edges dark with ink and ash. His hands rested on the table, steady, but his eyes were distant, fixed, not on the victories behind him, but on the rumors to the east. Faraj entered quietly, his armor gleaming in the faint light. "The northern caravans have arrived, my lord. They bring troubling news." Baybars didn't look up. "The Mongols." Faraj nodded. "They've taken Baghdad." The words hung heavy in the air. The city of knowledge, the jewel of Islam, gone, burned to ash. Baybars exhaled slowly. "Then the storm has come to our door." He rose, walking toward the open balcony. The city stretched before him, peaceful and sleeping beneath the stars. He remembered the last battle, the sand, the smoke, the endless screams, and knew that what was coming would be far worse. "The Crusaders fought for faith," he murmured. "The Mongols fight for nothing but fire." Faraj stepped closer. "Shall the first prepare the army?" Baybar shook his head. "Not yet. Let them come closer. Let them believe Egypt weak from war." Hai turned to face his old friend. "We will fight them on the ground of our choosing, not theirs." Faraj frowned. "And if Cairo falls?" Baybar's voice was low, certain. "Then Cairo will rise again. But if Egypt kneels once, she will never stand." Outside, thunder rolled in the distance. Meanwhile, Yusuf walked through the narrow alleys of Cairo's old quarter, far from the citadel's polished walls. The people still spoke of him as one of the heroes of Damietta, though he wore no medals, no armor, only a simple robe and the weight of memory. He visited the families of fallen soldiers, offering what little comfort he could. Mothers wept, children clung to his hands, and old men recited prayers for sons who would never return. Every face was a reminder that victory was built from bones. That night, sat by the Nile. The moon reflected on its surface like a silver blade. A woman approached one of the market vendors he had helped weeks before. She carried a basket of dates and bread. "You still come here?" she said softly. "Even after all that's happened?" Yusuf nodded. "It's quiet here. The river doesn't judge." She sat beside him. "They say Baybars will be sultan soon. Do you think he will bring peace?" Yusuf looked out at the water. "He'll bring strength. Sometimes that's the only peace a land like ours can have." The woman was silent for a moment, then asked, "And you? Will you fight again?" Yusuf hesitated. "If I must, but I've seen enough death for one lifetime." The woman smiled sadly. "No one ever says that twice." Before Yusuf could reply, a distant rumble echoed across the night. It wasn't thunder this time. It was drums. War drums. By morning, Cairo was alive with alarm. Riders from the eastern frontier had arrived discovered, half dead, from exhaustion. Their message was simple and terrible. The Mongols were advancing through Syria, and nothing had stopped them yet. Baybars summoned his council at once. The room was filled with the scent of burning incense and the sound of frantic voices. Maps were spread, messages unrolled, and the air grew thick with fear. "They've taken Aleppo," said one messenger, "and Homs is burning. The Caliph of Baghdad is dead. They slaughter all who resist." Faraj slammed his fist on the table. "Then we march now. We cannot wait until they reach our borders." Baybar's voice cut through the noise. "We will not meet them in open desert. Their cavalry is unmatched. We must use the land, the river, the heat, the wind." He looked to Yusuf, who had been summoned among the commanders. "You fought in the dunes. Tell me, what does the desert teach?" Yusuf met his gaze. "It teaches patience, my lord. Those who chase the mirage die of thirst before they find it." Baybars smiled faintly. "Then we make the Mongols chase one." Within days, Cairo transformed into a fortress. Every gate reinforced, every well guarded. Farmers abandoned their fields and fled behind the walls. The air buzzed with tension as soldiers sharpened their swords and priests prayed through the night. Baybars rode among his men, speaking to them not as a sultan, but as a soldier. "The Mongols burn everything they see," he told them. "They believe no wall can stop them, no army can face them. But they have not yet faced Egypt. They have not yet seen the strength of those who fight for their home." The men roared in response, their voices echoing through the stone streets. Meanwhile, on the far edge of the eastern desert, the first Mongol scouts appeared, small, swift riders with curved bows and wolfskin cloaks. They watched from the ridges, silent as shadows, before vanishing back into the dunes. The storm was coming closer. Yusuf sent with a small detachment to the frontier to scout the Mongol advance. The journey was long and brutal, days of heat, nights of freezing wind. The desert stretched endless around them, empty and watching. On the fifth night, T saw it, a glow on the horizon, faint but growing. Not fire from a camp, but from a burning city. The Mongols were near. Yusuf's captain whispered, "They move faster than we thought." Yusuf said nothing. He could already hear the faint sound of drums beneath the wind, slow, steady, and merciless. He turned his horse back toward Cairo. "We must warn Baybars. The storm is here." Back in the capital, Baybars stood once again at the balcony of the citadel. The stars were fading, the first light of dawn touching the sky. He could feel the weight of history pressing on his shoulders. He whispered to himself, "The Crusaders came for faith. The Mongols come for the world." He turned from the city, his voice steady, almost calm. "Then let the world remember Egypt." The horns of Cairo sounded as the first rays of sunlight struck the domes of the mosques. The city woke not to prayers, but to preparation. Soldiers formed ranks. Black banners rose above the walls, and across the Nile, the drums of the Mongols began to answer. The war that would decide the fate of empires had begun, and in the heart of it, one man, Baybar, stood, ready to carve his name not in victory, but in history itself. The desert wind howled again, older than kings, whispering through the stones of Cairo, "This is not the end. This is the beginning of legends." The desert trembled before dawn. A crimson haze hung over the eastern horizon, where the Mongol horde approached like a living storm. Their banners, black horses, and red suns fluttered against the wind, and the sound of 1,000 hooves rolled across the dunes like thunder from the towers of Cairo. Smoke could already be seen rising far in the distance. Villages along the frontier had fallen one by one, their wells poisoned, their people slaughtered. No messenger returned from the border. Only silence came back with the wind. Baybars stood atop the citadel ramparts as scouts reported the approach. His face was calm, but his eyes burned with fury. Faraj stood beside him, armor shining under the pale morning light. "They're 3 days out," Faraj said quietly. "If the reports are true, they number into tens of thousands." Baybars nodded slowly. "They are not the first army to think Egypt will fall easily. They will learn as others have learned." Behind them, Cairo was alive with tension. The great city had become a war camp. Myths worked without rest. Kias, soldiers trained in the streets, and the mosques echoed with prayers for deliverance. Women prepared bandages and filled jars with water for the wounded. The Nile, once calm and endless, now seemed restless, its surface broken by the shadows of war. In a narrow quarter near the old market, Yusuf gathered his detachment. His men were weary from the long ride, dust still clinging to their faces. They had seen the Mongol fire with their own eyes. "They burned the earth," said one of his men, voice trembling. "Not just the people, the fields, the animals, even the graves. There's nothing left where they pass." Yusuf tightened the strap on his sword. "Then we'll give them something they cannot burn." "What's that?" another asked. "Our resolve." The men said nothing more. Words meant little when death rode on the wind. That evening, Baybars summoned his commanders into the great hall of the citadel. The air was thick with smoke and the scent of oil lamps. Maps of the Nile Delta stretched across the marble table, marked with stones and pins. "They outnumber us 3-1, said Faraj, his voice heavy. "If we meet them in open battle, they'll crush us." Baybar's gaze moved across the table, studying the curves of the Nile. "Then we won't meet them in open battle. We'll make them drown in the very river they think they can cross." He placed a finger on a narrow stretch of land between two branches of the river. "Al-Manshura, the gateway to Cairo. We'll fortify it and wait for them there." One of the younger generals frowned. "But my lord, that's where the Crusaders were slaughtered years ago." Baybars looked at him sharply. "And it is where Egypt was saved. The dead of Manshura will fight beside us again." The room fell silent. No one questioned them after that. By nightfall, the Egyptian army was on the move, thousands of soldiers marching through the moonlit desert, their armor glinting faintly like scales of a serpent. The sound of their sandals and hooves blended with the low hum of war chants. "YUSUF Road, near the front," sighed Faraj. He glanced at the horizon, where faint red fires glowed far away. "They're coming faster than we thought," Akhand nodded grimly. "They always do." At dawn, the army reached Al-Manshura, once a quiet trading town by the river. It now became a fortress of desperation. Engineers worked through the day to build wooden barriers, dig trenches, and set traps beneath the sands. Farmers and fishermen became soldiers overnight. The Nile glimmered beside them, calm and beautiful, a silent witness to what was coming. Baybars moved among the men, speaking to them one by one. "You are not fighting for glory," he told them. "You are fighting for your homes, for your children, for every stone that holds this land together. The Mongols do not understand such things. That is why they will lose." The men bowed their heads in respect. Even those who had once doubted him now followed without question. On the second night, Yusuf sat beside a small fire, sharpening his blade. The stars above seemed unnaturally bright, as if the heavens themselves watched. A messenger arrived, covered in dust and blood. "They're less than a day away," he gasped. "Their vanguard crosses the river at dawn." Faraj turned to Baybars. "Shall we strike first?" Baybars shook his head. "No, let them think we are afraid. Let them cross. When the river runs red, then we attack." Ha! The next morning broke like the world itself was holding its breath. Mist clung to the banks of the Nile. Across the water, the Mongol vanguard appeared, lines of horsemen with longbows, their armor dark and polished, their faces hidden behind metal masks. They crossed the shallows, easily, laughing, confident. Behind them came the siege wagons, the drums, the endless tide of riders. Then, with a single motion of his hand, Baybars gave the signal. A roar split the air. Egyptian catapults hurled flaming barrels into the water. Arrows darkened the sky. The first wave of Mongols screamed as fire spread across the river. Horses reared, men fell, and chaos rippled through their ranks from the western bank. Yusuf led a charge of cavalry straight into the confusion. His men struck like lightning, cutting through the disoriented enemy before they could regroup. The clash of steel rang out, echoing over the river. "Push them back," Yusuf shouted. Into the fire. The Mongols fought fiercely, their curved sabers flashing, but the narrow banks trapped them. Their numbers became their weakness. Horses trampled one another, men slipped into the burning water, and the Nile swallowed them whole. On the hill above, Baybars watched calmly. "Now," he said quietly. He raised his hand again, and hidden from sight, Egyptian archers emerged from the trenches. Thousands of arrows flew at once, blotting out the sun. The Mongols screamed as the sky itself seemed to fall upon them by midday. The river ran red. The Mongol vanguard was shattered, their survivors fleeing eastward. The fields were littered with broken spears, torn banners, lifeless bodies, half submerged in mud. But Baybars did not celebrate. He knew this was only the beginning. That night, as the army tended to its wounded, Yusuf found him alone near the riverbank, staring into the dark water. "We won today," Yusuf said quietly. Baybars didn't turn. "No, we survived today. There's a difference." "Their army will come again," Yusuf said, "twice as strong." Baybars nodded. "And we will be ready. Egypt has no choice but to be ready." The wind blew across the river, carrying the faint scent of smoke and iron. "Do you believe we can truly stop them?" Yusuf asked. Baybars finally looked at him. His eyes were cold, but alive. "No empire is eternal. Not theirs, not ours. But while I breathe, Egypt will not fall." The two men stood in silence, watching as the moon rose over the blood-darkened Nile in the distance. Faint Mongol horns echoed through the desert, once more signals of regrouping. The war was not over. It had only begun to show its true face. The desert whispered again, carrying the promise of more blood, more fire, more history to be written, and deep within that endless night, the fate of two worlds, the steppe and the sand, prepared to collide once more. The Nile was silent again, but the silence was heavy, the kind that hides thunder before it breaks. In the weeks following the Battle of Amanshura, the Egyptian soldiers buried their dead by torchlight, each grave marked by a single stone and a whispered prayer. The fields had become graveyards, and the air still carried the scent of smoke and iron. Yusuf walked among the mounds at dawn, his boots sinking into the wet earth. The fog clung low over the ground, curling like ghosts between the graves. He stopped before one, a nameless soldier, a boy no older than 17. Yusuf knelt, brushing the sand from the stone. "He fought bravely," came a voice behind him. Baybars stood there, cloaked in black, his eyes shadowed. "They all did," Yusuf said quietly. "But for how long can men keep fighting like this?" Baybars looked out toward the horizon. "Until they have no choice but to stop, or until they win." The two men stood in silence, the wind carrying the faint echo of distant horns, not from Egypt, but from the east. The Mongols had not retreated far. Their scouts still roamed the edge of the desert, their campfires flickering in the distance like stars that refused to die. The rumors were relentless. New Mongol reinforcements were coming from the north, led by Kitbuka himself, a general whose name carried the weight of fear. He was said to have crushed kingdoms and burned cities without ever taking a wound. In Cairo, the mood had shifted. The people no longer whispered of victory. They whispered of survival. Food grew scarce. The Nile's trade routes were blocked, key, and every caravan that ventured east vanished without a trace. Yet Baybars refused to yield. Inside the citadel, his war council gathered once again. The torches flickered against the high stone walls, casting restless shadows across the faces of weary men. "They are regrouping," said Faraj, pointing to the map. "Their main force is less than 10 days away. If we wait here, Cairo will be surrounded." Baybar's gaze stayed fixed on the map. "Then we will not wait here." The generals looked at him, uncertain. "We move to Ain Jalut," Baybar said. "That valley will be their grave." A murmur rippled through the room. Ain Jalut, the spring of Goliath, was a place of legend, deep in the plains near Palestine. It was where David was said to have slain Goliath. To march there meant leaving Egypt's walls and meeting the Mongols on open ground. Madness to some, destiny to others. Faraj spoke carefully. "My lord, that's beyond our borders. The people will see it as suicide." Baybar's eyes narrowed. "Then let them call it that. Better to die fighting in the open than waiting behind walls for the fire to reach us." Yusuf stepped forward. "You mean to lure them?" Baybars nodded. "Yes. Let Kitbuka believe we are desperate, fleeing our own land. Let him chase us where the river cannot save him. The valley will close around him like a trap." For the first time in days, a faint spark of hope flickered in the room. Preparations began that night. Cairo wept as its defenders marched away. Women lined the streets, pressing water and bread into the soldiers' hands, whispering prayers. The old men blessed them. The children followed until the gates closed behind. Under a pale moon, the Egyptian army moved north, a silent river of steel flowing through the desert. The nights were cold, the days unbearable. Sandstorms rose without warning, blinding the men and choking the horses. But still they marched, driven by a cause greater than fear. Yusuf rode beside Faraj, his cloak whipping in the wind. "How many do we have left?" 15,000, maybe less, Faraj replied. "The Mongols have twice that number. And yet we go to meet them." Faraj gave a tired smile. "Because Baybar's commands, and because Egypt has no other choice." 3 days later, they reached Ain Jalut. The valley stretched wide and silent, framed by low hills and scattered palms. A stream cut through the center, the spring that gave the place its name. Baybars studied the land carefully. "This will do," he ordered his men to set ambush positions among the hills, concealing archers behind rocks and brush. Cavalry units were placed out of sight, hidden by the curves of the valley. Debate, a small vanguard under Yusuf's command, would remain visible in the open plain, pretending to retreat at the first sign of the Mongol charge. It was a gamble. If timing failed, they would all be crushed. That night, as the soldiers rested in silence, Yusuf sat by the stream. The water glimmered in the moonlight, peaceful, untouched by the blood it would soon carry. He heard footsteps and looked up to find Baybar standing behind him. "You chose this place well," Yusuf said. Baybars shook his head. "No, God chose it. We are only the hands that hold the sword." Okay. He knelt beside the water, dipping his fingers in. "Do you know what they call this spring?" Yusuf nodded. "The spring of Goliath." Baybars smiled faintly. "Then tomorrow we'll see who is David." Dawn broke with the scream of horns. The Mongols came like thunder, their dust clouds darkening the sky. Banners of black and red filled the horizon. And at their center rode Kipuka, a towering figure in crimson armor, his horse foaming at the mouth. He carried no shield, only a long curved saber that glinted like fire. Yusuf's men waited in the open plain, pretending fear, pulling back slowly as the Mongols advanced. Arrows rained down, thudding into shields and sand. The earth shook beneath the charge of their horses. "Hold!" Yusuf shouted. "Not yet, not yet." The Mongols closed in, the air filled with screams and the clash of steel. At the last possible moment, Yusuf raised his sword. "Now, fall back." His men turned and fled toward the valley, the Mongols chasing them with wild cries. The trap was set as the enemy thundered into the narrow pass. Baybars gave the signal. From both sides, Egyptian archers emerged, unleashing volleys of arrows into the confined space. The Mongols faltered, their momentum broken. Then came the cavalry Faraj's riders, sweeping down from the hills like a storm, swords flashing in the sun. The valley became chaos. Men screamed, horses crashed, and the air filled with dust and fire. Yusuf rejoined the main line, fighting through the madness. He saw Kitbuka in the distance, cutting down soldiers with terrifying speed. His saber slicing through armor as if it were cloth. Baybars spurred his horse forward, his own blade drawn. "Kitbuka," he roared, his voice echoing through the valley. "Come and meet your equal." The Mongol general turned, eyes blazing. The two warriors clashed in a fury of motion, steel ringing against steel. Kitbuka's strength was monstrous, but Baybars was faster, precise, driven by purpose. Sparks flew as their swords met again and again. Finally, Baybars feinted left, then struck low, his blade cutting across Kitbuka's leg. The Mongol staggered, roaring in pain. Before he could recover, Baybars drove his sword through his chest. Kitbuka fell from his horse, gasping. "You think this will stop us?" He rasped. Baybars leaned close. "No, but it will remind the world that even giants bleed." He wrenched the blade free. The Mongol banners wavered, their riders hesitating as their leader fell. Seizing the moment, Yusuf rallied the Egyptian lines. "Forward, for Egypt." The cry spread like wildfire. Every soldier roared it, every blade lifted high. The Mongols began to break. Some fled into the desert. Others fought to the death by sunset. The valley of Angelut was silent again, littered with the wreckage of empires. Yusuf found Baybars standing amid the fallen, his sword dripping red. The wind carried the smell of blood and victory. "It's over," Yusuf said softly. Baybars shook his head. "No, it has only begun. The Mongols will remember this day, and they will come again. But so will we." He looked toward the horizon, where the dying sun painted the sand in gold. Egypt stood today. "That is enough." The soldiers cheered behind him, their voices rising into the sky, echoing through the valley that had once been a legend, and now was one again. And as night fell over Angelut, the desert seemed to breathe, whispering the story of a people who refused to kneel. The desert was quiet again, too quiet, after the Battle of Angelut. The land itself seemed to hold its breath, as if afraid to disturb the ghosts that now ruled the sands. The Mongols were gone, their banners trampled into the dirt, their dead scattered across the valley. Egypt had survived what the world believed was impossible, but victory had a price. Yusuf walked through the aftermath, his armor cracked, his sword dull with blood. Around him, the air smelled of dust and smoke. Horses wandered without riders. The moans of the wounded echoed between the hills like distant thunder. He stopped when he saw Faraj, sitting against a broken shield, his eyes half closed. "You fought well," Yusuf said softly. Faraj tried to smile. "Tell Baybars, Egypt stands because of him." Yusuf knelt, pressing a hand to his shoulder. "You'll tell him yourself." "Okay." But Faraj shook his head. His hand fell limp, the life fading from his face as the sun bled out behind the hills. For a long moment, Yusuf said nothing. He just stared at the endless sand, at the countless lives buried beneath it. Then he rose, his body trembling, but his heart still burning. He had seen enough death to last 1,000 lives, but something inside him knew this wasn't the end. Not yet. Baybars stood on a small ridge overlooking the battlefield. His armor was blackened, his cloak torn, but his presence was unbroken, a figure carved from defiance itself. When Yusuf approached, Baybars turned to him, his expression unreadable. "It's done," Yusuf said. Baybars nodded slowly. "Yes, the Mongols are broken. Their empire bleeds into dust." Right. He looked toward the horizon. "But now comes the harder war." Yusuf frowned. "What war?" Baybar's voice was low, weary, but sharp. "The one for power. The one fought not with swords, but with crowns." Days later, the army returned to Cairo. The people lined the streets, cheering, throwing flowers from rooftops. The sound of drums filled the air. They called Baybars the savior of Egypt, the lion of the Nile. Behind the celebration, whispers stirred in the shadows. The Sultan Qutuz had led the army in name, but it was Baybars who had truly commanded. And in victory, loyalty began to fracture. In the palace, the air was thick with tension. Baybars stood before Qutuz in the grand audience chamber. The Sultan sat on his golden throne, his face pale beneath the weight of his crown. "You've done well," Qutuz said. "Egypt owes you everything." Baybars bowed his head slightly. "Egypt owes her victory to all who fought, the men, the commanders, not just me." Qutuz studied him, his eyes narrow. "And yet they chant your name, not mine." Baybars met his gaze. "Names do not win wars, my Sultan. Deeds do." The silence between them was sharp enough to draw blood. That night, Yusuf stood guard outside the royal tent as the army camped on its return march. The desert wind blew cold, carrying whispers of unrest. He heard muffled voices from inside, Baybars, Qutuz, and others. The argument grew louder. "You think I don't see it?" Qutuz shouted. "You want my throne. You've always wanted it." Baybar's voice was calm, but deadly. "I want only a ruler worthy of Egypt's sacrifice." A crash followed metal against marble, then silence. Moments later, Baybars stepped out of the tent, his hands red with blood. His eyes were hard, distant. Yusuf stared at him. "What have you done?" Baybars wiped his blade. "What was necessary?" The soldiers outside froze, unsure what to do. Then, slowly, one by one, they knelt. "All hail Sultan Baybars," a voice said. Then another. Then 100 more. The desert echoed with their cries. Yusuf didn't kneel. He just looked at Baybars, his heart heavy with the weight of understanding. Victory had never been about peace. It had always been about power. Weeks passed. Cairo thrived again under Baybar's rule. The streets filled with trade, the mosques with prayers. The Mongols dared not return. Egypt was strong, stronger than ever, but strength has a shadow. Yusuf watched from afar as Baybars built his empire, a vast network of armies, spies, and fear. Those who questioned him vanished quietly in the night. The same man who had saved Egypt now ruled it with iron hands. One evening, Baybar summoned Yusuf to the citadel. "You've avoided me," Baybar said. "I've been watching," Yusuf replied. "You've built something great. But tell me, my Sultan, at what cost?" Baybars smiled faintly. "At every cost. Power does not grow from mercy." "Then, what do we fight for?" Yusuf's voice cracked. "If not for mercy, for peace." Baybars looked at him long and hard. "We fought for survival. Peace is the illusion the weak cling to before the strong take it from them." Yusuf stepped closer, anger in his eyes. "The man I followed at Ain Jalut believed in Egypt. Now I see only a man who believes in himself." Right. For a moment, the air between them turned to ice. Then Baybar said quietly, "Leave, Yusuf, before I forget what you meant to me." Yusuf bowed his head and left without another word. That was the last time they spoke. Years passed. Cairo changed. Empires rose and fell around it, but Egypt endured. Baybar's name became legend, the warrior king who crushed the Mongols and rebuilt a nation from dust. But legends, like wars, are never simple. One night, deep in the desert, far from the city, An old traveler sat by a dying fire, telling stories to a group of children. His beard was gray, his eyes distant. They say Baybars ruled for years, he said softly, that his enemies trembled at his name. But when the moon was high and the wind was still, he would walk alone on the walls of Cairo, looking east toward the desert, as if waiting for something or someone. One of the children asked, who was he waiting for? The old man smiled sadly, perhaps for peace, or perhaps for the friend he lost along the way. He looked out into the dunes, where the wind whispered over the sand, a sound like the echo of a long-forgotten prayer. History remembers the conquerors, the old man murmured, but it's the haunted ones who remember history. The fire burned low. The desert stretched endless and silent, holding the stories of kings and killers, saints and soldiers. And in that silence, under the starlit sky of Egypt, the ghosts of Angelut rode forever unseen, but never gone. The wind carried their voices still, for Egypt, for the fallen, for the price that victory demands. The flames flickered once more, then died,